Okay folks, thanks for watching the video here. It's really just a very quick introduction to programming with PHP using the new PHP AOP extension. It's still currently in beta at the time that I'm working with this. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly through this. I'm going to give you some very quick information about the concepts and some of the terminology, but I'll be particularly focusing on some hands-on coding. So first of all, just for anybody who's not familiar with AOP, it's a good idea if you're going to be watching this and taking it all in that you have an understanding of OOP, so object-oriented programming, and it'd be quite good as well if you're familiar with solid design principles as well. I'm just going to very quickly move through this then. It's usually referred to as AOP and can also help us to overcome many of the challenges that are common to complex application development, and it's easiest to begin understanding AOP by understanding some of the challenges we face. We often need to test situations against predefined criteria and potentially allow different behavior to be applied based on the result of those tests, and we typically want to avoid duplication of code wherever possible while also reducing the effort of maintaining the application. Now, commonly you'll hear people talking about AOP in relation to working with caching and security and logging, but there are of course many other applications for it as well. Now, the terminology that you'll hear people talking about an advice. Now, an advice really is a definition of what's to be applied. In the context of working with this PHP extension, then typically you'll be talking about an advice as being a callback which contains some functionality that you want to be carried out when a particular method is called. You can trigger that action. We'll talk about that in just a little while, but join points, that's where advice will be applied. A point cut, that's the combination of join points where the advice is applied, and an aspect, well, we're talking about applying the advice at the point cut. Now, if you were feeling at all lost with this, or if you found AOP at all confusing, probably the easiest way to think of it, particularly from the point of view of join points, you might hear people talking about before, after, and around. Okay, now the easiest way to think about it is if you've got a method, you really have the opportunity to carry out something specific as far as action is concerned before that method is called, after that method is called, and essentially around, which is either side of the method, so at the beginning and also at the end, before it starts and after it has been. Okay, so in terms of what that means we can do, let's move on over to the virtual machine and have a look at that, and I'll show you what I've got in here. I'm going to be uploading this to GitHub, and if I go through this a little bit too quickly, I suppose one of the good things is that it's a recording. You'll be able to pause it and go back, but I will try and move through it relatively quickly so that you just get the gist of it and can pick up and run with it. As I say, I'll be uploading this to GitHub as well so that you can get in there and start playing with it. One of the things I think that can potentially hold people back from getting into looking at a new extension is maybe the time it takes to get something up and running that allows you to work with it. So this little application, the whole point of it is just to allow you to get in and start playing with it. So what I've got here, say something very quick, that the whole point of it is a little application which is going to render some static page content. I've got an application object which I've defined here. It's got some methods in it, and each one of these methods is just meant to define a stage of the application's normal cycle. So we've got the bootstrapping, the application running, then we've got the routing, then we've got rendering, and then we've got a shutdown. Okay, so that's what it's meant to do in its normal cycle. Okay, if we just very quickly look at that class, you'll see that we've got some properties up at the top of it. There's the application object itself. When we've got the environment, we've got a router and renderer. Okay, and if we just look at the methods, they're quite straightforward. We've got a whole stack of getters and setters, but as we get down here, there's the bootstrap method. It's just going to echo out bootstrapping just for clarity of what it's doing. Then it's going to set up the environment. We've got here run method, again just echoing out what it's doing, and the route method, that's where we start to get a little bit more complicated. We're just bringing into play a URL object. We're passing to its constructor the URL itself that we're currently on, and then we're instantiating a router object, and we're passing the URL into the route method as its only parameter, echoing out that we're routing the request, and then again returning the application object. If you we're wondering, I've got all these chained together. That's the reason that they're all chained together nice and easily. Each one of those methods is returning the application object. After it's done what it's doing, it returns the application object, so we can just call them all in a nice little line there. If we move on here to look at the render method within the application class, we can see here that we're instantiating a new static page renderer, and then the render has a render method. And we've got our shutdown method just saying it's shutting down. We've also defined a force shutdown, which we could call just to bring the application to a halt at any point in time. So that was just a very quick overview of the main methods that we've got going on here. What I wanted to do was just focus then on what I've done in order to start working with the aspect-oriented programming in here. First of all, you need to make sure that you've got the particular extension enabled that I was talking about, and you can visit github.com/AOP-PHP/AOP to be able to go and grab the information about how to install that. Probably the easiest way is if you're using Linux or Ubuntu, whatever there, you can go in and run the command line instructions in order to enable that, and then go to your php.ini file and then enable the extension. Okay, so once you've done that, you should be able to work with the application as I've got it here straight away. All of this stuff that's going on here, it's just basic stuff like setting up the environment. If you're running into any problems like getting a blank screen, just comment that out and you'll be able to get the errors there pretty quick. And just defining a whole stack of constants to make it nice and easy to find the files we're looking for and the ones that you'll want to concentrate on for working with the extension is this include here. Just to explain what I've done, I've set this up so that when we bring this include into play, it will then have if we look at the file it's actually including, that'll probably be easier. I've set it up so that we've got classes which represent the relevant aspects that I wanted to work with, and really what I'm doing is I'm targeting specific methods within the application. So the naming convention I've used for the classes, it's basically where our advice is going to be applied, the class that we're targeting and the method that we're listening for. So down here you'll see that if we bring this one into play, actually this is probably a nice easy one to look at first of all and see what's happening. If we were bringing this into play, we've got this class before URL construct, and what we're doing is we're going to be before the construct method of the URL class is called. Okay, so before the object's instantiated, before that construct method's called, we're going to be trying to do something. Okay, that's going to be a bit of a clue with that naming structure what I've done. Before we jump ahead, I want to just disable that again for a second and show you what happens if we serve up the index.php file here just now. By default, what's happening is it's just, as I say, echoing out each of the stages that it's at. So bootstrapping, getting the config, running the application, instantiating the router, processing the route, so on and so forth, continuing on to the point where it eventually shuts down. Okay, if I flip back here then and say that we're going to be using one of our AOP techniques here to manipulate the behavior of the application directly based on certain criteria. Let's have a look here just now. If I go in to the before URL construct class, we'll open that up. I've got it in a folder called aspects here. You can probably tell from the name spacing there. So if we go into that just now, before URL construct, what we'll do is we'll focus first of all in this class. As I say, this is the naming convention that I'm using with it. If you look at the construct method, I've got everything in here, and really if you think about this as just registering a listener for a particular method and then specifying what we want to do when we actually hear that method being called, then this is the part we want to concentrate on here. Okay, this is using the internal function AOP add before, which is provided to us via the AOP extension that I showed you before. And what you do first of all with its first parameter is you specify what you're actually listening out for. So in this case we're listening out for the URL object, calling its construct method. Okay, So when it's being instantiated, okay, that's what we're listening out for. And then we're specifying what we're going to do. Now this is the advice, okay, this is essentially, in terms of this extension, it's a callback. As I say, it's containing the functionality we want to take place. So all this that you can see here is me defining a callback, and there are extra bits of code in here which are just for purposes of demonstrating this just now, just to give us an idea of what's going on. So folks, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm just again going to comment this out and show you the index.php file again. At this point in time, the part we want to focus on is within the application. Yeah, if we're going to use this one before URL construct, let's look at the application, look at the route method, and you can see here when we bring the URL object into play, okay, so this is essentially at the construct point that we're calling the construct method here, and we're passing in the raw URL. Okay, now for anybody who's not familiar with this, that means that whatever's after the domain, basically it'll be /hello is what's going to be passed in there if we were on this page here. Okay, so if we look at that here just now, what we're going to do is we're going to be trying to affect the behavior of the application at this point right here. If we look at what we're going to do, is we're going to, first of all, we're going to say before URL construct, for shutdown bad URL advice, we're going to echo that out to say it's now active. Okay, so you can see there we're saying it's now active. We're just going to echo that out. Important to point out that you'll always get an AOP join point object in here, and when you get the AOP object join point object in there, you can call the get arguments method on it. Okay, so when you call the get arguments method on it, if you say, for instance, in this particular case, our construct method of the URL object, it's taking a URL, okay, and in the application itself you could see here that it was taking in the URL, okay, sorry, it was taking in the URL here, okay. So what that means is that argument actually will be accessible when we are inside of the advice there. So when that is being triggered, we'll be able to go in, get arguments, call the get arguments, okay, and all going well, we'll have the URL in there that we can work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable it just now and show you how it starts to affect things. Okay, so I've enabled it there, and then I'm going to run it, and you can see here it's telling us that that's now active. You can see here that I've got a string, and that string is hello. If I change this to be something else like goodbye, then of course it updates nice and easily. We can see that we're grabbing the current URL there, whatever's been supplied to us. Now you can see there's some other things happening here as well. It's saying that it's checking for a bad URL, and it's saying the URL is okay. Now of course the logic I'm using in here is extremely simplistic. It's hard coded, it's hard baked, just to try and get a quick example across. So what I'm doing here is we're looking to see if we've got an array of arguments, which of course we do, and then to see if there's actually more, if there's more than none in there. We want to see if there's at least one. Okay, so if there's at least one, we're going to grab the first one, and we're going to check it to see if it matches the string bad URL, /bad URL. Now if it does, we're then going to go off, we're going to grab the application, we're going to grab the instance of our application. We're then going to call the force shutdown method. Now obviously you could do other things, this is just a bit of an extreme example to show how we can affect the behavior, and what we're going to say pass in there is a little message saying we found a bad URL. If it was all okay, it was just going to do what it did there when we had hello and goodbye, saying URL is okay. Okay, so if we supply bad URL here, we can see now that it's forcing our application to shut down. Okay, and it's telling us there the message that it found a bad URL. Okay, if we had a normal URL that wasn't bad, you could see it was continuing on and doing what we wanted to do. So we were able to completely manipulate the behavior of our application based on something just as simple as the URL. So it gives us a lot of power. We don't necessarily need to add anything into our application class to handle behavior. We can influence it from outside and do it in a way which allows us to decouple that behavior from the rest of the application. We can just go in there and manipulate it right away, and we're just listening out for that method being called and then applying that check on it. So you can see why for something like security that would be really useful potentially, yeah. And like all things, and particularly, given that this is still in beta, probably want to be a little bit careful about, using it. I'm not saying that it's necessarily production ready. I don't really know at this point in time whether it is or not. I guess it depends on what your criteria is for that, and ultimately, if you do put together some tests, as we all really should be anyway, put together some tests to define whether or not it's behaving as you'd expect. You can imagine if you're in a particularly complex application, maybe you start to use more and more of these techniques, you could potentially find that depending on the order that they're called in, that the result that you get back might be different from that which you expect. So you want to be that little bit careful there as to making sure you've got adequate tests in place to ensure that you're getting what you expect. So that aside, let's start looking at a couple more examples. All the examples I have here are based on using this AOP add before, and my hope is that if you find this useful, you would just download the application from GitHub and use it as a starting point just to accelerate your learning with it, and also pick up the manual. The manual, as I say, you're able to get nice and easily from the GitHub pages too. Great information in there about why you would want to use it potentially. It also goes into more advanced functionality, some of the other methods that the other functions that they provide via the extension, and get into things like using wildcards with matching particular methods that we're listening out for. So hopefully this will just give you an opportunity to pick it up and run with it quite quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of the other things that we've got on the go. With aspects here, I've got another two that I want to show you. We've got one which is before router process route. Okay, so if I have a look at that there just now for you, the router object, it has a process route here. Here we go. Yep, there we are. You can see that really what happens is we've got a route method which calls process route, and then in process route we've got something really quickly hacked together just because we're simulating checking for static pages, and really simply there we've got an array of pages that we actually have in the application. If we were to look at this static pages folder here, you can see there are two files, goodbye and hello, and really what we're doing here is just an associative array where ideally whatever would be passed in there into the URL would be the key, and then the value would be the file itself with whatever the full path to the file is. Now obviously that's just a very simple quick hack, so the idea is here that if somebody was to supply a valid URL, it should match up there. Now to illustrate the way that the behavior can be manipulated again in different ways you could use it, I guess you could even think of it as you could use this for dependency injection even if you wanted. If we look at what's happening in the application, we've got these two separate objects, the router and the renderer, and neither of them know anything about each other. Okay, the router knows nothing about the renderer, and likewise renderer knows nothing about the router. And what ends up happening is, or what's going to happen is, we're going to look here, and before the static page renderer's render method is called, we're going to pass it the relevant information so it can render it. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to grab that information from the router itself. So let's have a look at the two aspects I was talking about here. We've got one which is before router process route, and we've got before static page renderer render. Okay, so first of all, this is probably a good point to go into talk about what I've done with the process route. I thought that it would be a good idea, potentially, rather than processing a completely raw URL, it'd be a good idea to manipulate the behavior here. So let's look at that class and see what's going on. What we're doing here in this particular case is we're looking out for our router's process route method. Okay, we're listening for that, and then we're going to carry out this particular action, the advice that we've defined up here. We're going to carry that out when this is triggered, okay, and before it's actually triggered we're going to apply all this. Okay, so what we'll look at here just now then is we know that we can call our getArguments method, and that'll go off and grab anything that's there. And in this case here I'm going to take out this debug print backtrace, and in just a moment we'll call this so we can see what's going on. You can see down here we're calling this giving a dump of the arguments that we've got back before anything's been done, and down here we're checking to see if the first argument that's in that array if of course if there is an argument, we're going to check there for it, and we're going to see whether it's an instance of the URL object, and if it is, then we're going to call the URL object's process URL method, which was just a convenience method in there to allow us to apply any filters and validators we might have in place. For the purposes of this demo, the URL object process URL method, it's just got down at the very bottom here, we're just going to replace any instance of hello with the word goodbye in a URL. So if we put a URL in that was hello, the idea would be that it would replace it with the word goodbye. Okay, so nice and simple there. What we'll do then is we will have a very quick look at this. We'll go in and save the changes to this here, so they've got our aspects included, so our before router process root. It's going to go off and it's going to process that URL. We'll see with the dump of that, as you can see there, we'll see what's been done to that. And then if we look at the other one, the before static page renderer one, we can see what we're going to do here is we're going to listen out for the static page renderer's render method, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply this particular advice that we've got here. And really what we're doing is we're going in here, grabbing the application, an instance of the application. Then what we're doing is we're going off, we're grabbing the router, we're checking for the match static page. Okay, so we're getting whatever that is, and then we're going to say, okay, let's go grab the renderer, and then we're going to set the static page, use the set static page method of the renderer and pass it that match static page. So the renderer and the router know nothing about each other, but what we've done is we've gone in here, grabbed the application, which does know about both of them, and we've taken the relevant information, and then we're injecting it where it's required. So that's what these two aspects are going to do. Let's have a look at what's happening now that they're in play within our application. You can see here now we've got our before router process route. Advice has been triggered here. We can see this is the raw arguments of the AOP join point object. So you can see there that the first item in there is a URL object, and you can see the properties there. We've got a raw URL, which is hello, which you can see is up there, and because that matches the criteria we were talking about, it's going to be converted to say goodbye. Okay, so this is a post the process URL method. Okay, and if you scroll down further here, you can see the action that's been carried out here. We can see that we have then requested the static page goodbye. Okay, so if we were to get rid of the process URL method, let's try just bringing that out of play. Haven't tried this part here, so if it doesn't work, then well, you won't worry about it. Yeah, no worries, that's fine. But yeah, so the key thing here to take from that is we can manipulate all sorts of things within our application. You're only really limited by your imagination with that, but of course if you're thinking about using this within anything that's going to be sort of critical, you want to make sure of course you're running lots of tests to make sure you get what you're expecting, and that if you add any additional aspects or apply them in various places, that they're not potentially messing with the rest of your expected values. Anyway, I hope that's been useful for you to get started with, and any feedback would be great. It's a topic which I think probably most people will find quite interesting. Hopefully you'll be able to make use of all this and get up and running with it pretty quick. So thanks for that, and all the best. Leave any comments you want to leave. Thanks for that. Take care.